Greetings, everyone. Another Q&A video, also known as office hours, also known as Ask Me Anything. These are now happening every other week in the Facebook group, which is then posted to YouTube as well, and every other week in Patreon. So if you want to see a Q&A video every week, you could join Patreon. Otherwise, it'll be every other week. Okay, so I've got some questions lined up here that people already wrote in. There might be a couple come up in the live feed, but I'm going to try to focus on the questions put in advance. So Nora says, there's 2 Ganesh statues in the yoga studio I go to. Was wondering if there was something polite to do to greet him before and or after practice. Yeah, now the Hindu tradition is not so formal, but there are nice little informal things in this regard. Now, of course, I mean, if it's an image of your Ishta Devata, the former aspect of the divine that you're most connected to on your home altar, then that's a different matter. You bow with your forehead on the floor and maybe do a full prostration, right? But if it's like a Ganesh or a Natarāj in a yoga studio, totally informal, nice little thing to do is you just touch the foot of the image, one of the feet of the image, and touch your heart. You can just do it casually, no big deal, right? You're not showing off for anyone, especially using this ring finger. It's called in English. But this finger here, if you touch the foot of the Natarāj or the Ganesh and touch your heart, that's nice. Now, we never use the index finger because this is considered the ego finger, right? The finger we point in accusing blame. This finger is never used in ritual. You don't hold incense. Even you don't hold incense like this because it involves the index, right? You hold incense like this. And you don't use this finger with your mala. It's kind of a way you can always tell if somebody's gotten traditional instruction, because if they'll count the beads of their mala doing their mantra japa without involving this finger. So that's just a little note about that. Kyle says, why can't consciousness be an aspect of mind? Well, that's a good question, right? Biologists who presume the philosophical view of materialism or physicalism, they believe consciousness is an aspect of mind. Consciousness is an epiphenomenon or an emergent property of not really mind, but the physical brain, according to these folks. Now, these folks, they assume that on the basis of a philosophical viewpoint called physicalism, which is the viewpoint that physical reality, physical matter is what's fundamental, and everything else, and nothing else is. So therefore, consciousness must be an after-the-fact, what's called epiphenomenon, or kind of side effect of particular organization of physical matter. Now, what's interesting about that is nobody, our best scientists have not been able to show how or why consciousness should emerge from any organization of physical matter, no matter how complex. So let's remember the brain, an incredibly complex organ, is still physical matter. It's just physical matter in a particular arrangement. And it's made of the same atoms that constitute everything else in the universe, right? So it's just a complex arrangement of physical matter. Now, why should an arrangement of physical matter, no matter how complex, give rise to consciousness, which is, in the most basic sense, the fact of experiencing, the fact that there's something it's like to be a human being. And there seems to be something it's like to be a dog or a cat, right? and that's consciousness, the fact of experience. Why? There's no answer in science. So what happens is, not only do physicalist scientists presume the view of physicalism, and therefore the view that consciousness is epiphenomenal to matter, matter being fundamental, they usually don't even realize that they are presuming it. They don't realize that they're beginning from an axiom which is unproven and indeed unprovable. The axiom that physical matter is what's fundamental and everything else is a side effect of that. Right? So the view of the consciousness-only view, which comes in various forms like idealism and panpsychism and different things, presumes that consciousness is fundamental, and what we call physical matter is rather an effect of consciousness. Now, this also cannot be proven. Neither view can be proven, right? And the best philosophers absolutely clearly acknowledge that. They know that neither view can be proven, right? So the reason, meditators, not all, but some meditators hold a consciousness-only view, it's on the basis of direct experience, and that direct experience has what's called a noetic quality. Something is proven, can be proven to you through direct experience that cannot be then proven to others. It's a quality of a certain kind of direct experience, this undeniable insight into the nature of reality that no matter how undeniable for you is not transferable to others, right? So that's a considerably big topic, but that's just a little bit about it, So for more on this, you might look at, a recent great book is Annika Harris's Consciousness. And this would present, various kind of aspects of it's just 100 pages long. It's totally readable. It presents different kind of views on the topic of consciousness, but correctly acknowledges that that we actually just don't know. We don't know why or how there should be consciousness, why it should be or how it can be, which itself is fascinating. It's considered one of the great unsolved problems in science. And there are those who doubt that it ever can be solved scientifically. Lynn says, well, she's asking about Tantric Bīja mantras, and in the context of that asks the question, can releasing one's own intuitive vocal sounds be as powerful as traditional Sanskrit bija sounds or mantras if they are imbued with intention? Well, the tradition would say, no, definitely not. Now, having said that, if you are a fully awakened, liberated being in an ecstatic state, your utterances are mantras, at least for your disciples. But in general, not otherwise. Why? Because traditional Sanskrit bija mantras and other forms of mantra are transmitted through generations and generations and are imbued, it's said, with the power of the practice of all those who pass on these mantras, the power of their practice and the power of their longing as well. So there's a kind of collective and cumulative effect of mantra being transmitted through generations of ardent and earnest practitioners. That's what's taught anyway. You can discover for yourself if that's true. Maureen says, does evolution ever move backwards? Well, this question presumes something, which is that evolution moves forwards. And that presumption is unwarranted. Evolution doesn't move in any direction. Evolution just means adaptation to change. And when we're talking in the context of biology, evolution means adaptation to change through natural selection, which just means that if a given configuration of genes makes it more likely the organism survives, then those genes tend to be passed on. And another configuration of genes that make it less likely that the organism survives tend not to be passed on. And so the language that scientists use is those genes in the former case are selected for. This or that gene is adaptive to the environment, and so it is selected for. It's passed on because those organisms survive to reproduce. Now, the sort of problem with this system is that environments can sometimes change rapidly, and genes that were adaptive in the former environment are still around now, even though they're no longer adaptive, right? So from that point of view, evolution can produce scenarios that are not at all ideal anymore, right? So in that, if you want to call that moving backwards, yes, absolutely. And there's many examples, but one of the most important examples in evolutionary biology that overlaps with spirituality is the fact that we evolved in small tribal groups of about 100 to 200 people. So in those contexts of small tribal groups, concern, even almost obsessive concern with what other people think about you, was adaptive. You were more likely to survive if you were really worried about what the other tribe members thought of you, right? Because you wouldn't survive without the tribe, right? If you were rejected or cast out, you would most likely die, because humans only survive through cooperation. They're not the sort of organism that could survive the ancient world, the prehistorical world solo, right? So, therefore, here we are, modern humans, with an almost obsessive concern about what other people think of us, but it's no longer adaptive. It no longer helps us survive. So it's what is called an atavism. It's something hanging around in a genetic structure of our brains. It's hardwired into our brains, but it's not. It's causing a lot of suffering, and it's not really helping anyone survive. It's not necessary to survive, and part of the reason is because we don't live in tribes, but it's also because there's so many of us that you can find your metaphorical tribe, right? People who appreciate you just as you are, even if your family of origin doesn't, right? So metaphorical tribes are very important to us, but they're not the same as literal tribes because our survival is not dependent upon them. That's a huge and interesting topic, and that's just a little bit about it. And there's a great blog on this subject by Tim Urban on Wait But Why, and we can post the link to it. It's well worth reading, about this atavism of concern or obsession with what other people think of you. Amy says, what is the difference between the Veda and the Upanishads, or the Vedas and the Upanishads, and who wrote each? Well, this is another question that presumes something not really valid for this tradition, because the Indian tradition in general refutes the idea of human authorship for its scriptures. Now, this is just going to sound absurd to modern thinkers, but there it is. It's the truth, right? So the Indian tradition believes that the Vedas were not authored by humans and not even by gods. The Vedas are thought to be inherent in the code of reality, right? That the mantras, at least, or the hymns of the Veda, are thought to be inherent in the microcode of reality itself, and that they appear every time the universe gets created. They appear at some point. That was the view. So Now, modern Indians, are almost completely divorced from their roots without knowing it. In general, they think it's the opposite. So modern Indians will, often extol the authorship of this or that Vedic sage, like Vasishta or Vishwamitra. But if you look more closely at the original sources, you see very, very clearly they say, no. These guys did not write the Vedic hymns. They heard them. They saw them and or heard them. And that the hymns are unauthored and embedded in the nature of fabric of reality itself. Now, the Tantric scriptures, by contrast, are thought to be revealed by divinities, or by divinity singular, under whatever name, Shiva, Shakti, Bhairava, Bhairavi, and so on, right? But they are thought to be divinely revealed. They're not thought to have human authorship. So it's a different paradigm of religion, right? Because in Western religion, quasi-divine human figures, or quasi-human divine figures, like Jesus, real name Yeshua Bar Yosef, and Muhammad and other such figures are not only pivotal to the religion, but the religion is all about them in some sense, right? And in the profession of faith in those religions has to include the names of these figures. Like, I believe that Jesus Christ is the one and only Son of God and he died for our sins. That is the number one profession of faith in Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity. And there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the profession of faith in Islam. Now, some people could argue we have a little bit of a parallel for that in Buddhism, where you declare I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. But who is the Buddha apart from the Dharma? We actually have no access to and no knowledge of anything about the Buddha apart from the Dharma that he taught. So it's not really three things there, even though that's, again, the triple refuge is, Buddhists are going to argue with me on that point. But if you just kind of look at it logically, it's there's no Buddha apart from the Dharma, except conceptually speaking, certainly not historically. Anyway, that's the exception, though. The Buddhist tradition is the exception in the sense of highlighting the importance of this historical figure, who in time was actually superseded by divinities called bodhisattvas. And in the rest of the Indian tradition, though, the different streams of tradition are not really anchored to or pinned on some particular human authorship. And again, this has changed in modern Hinduism just very, very recently, like the very, very recent new modern Hindu view that Shiva was an actual guy, a human, who lived thousands of years ago. This is professed by Sadhguru, among others, upon the basis of no evidence whatsoever, and it's a very new belief. It's never a belief professed by the tradition. From the point of view of the tradition, to hold that Shiva was a human, a historical human, would be and is a massive reduction of the meaning of Shiva. A massive reductionism and, in a sense, trivialization. Of course, Sadhguru doesn't see it that way, but from the traditional point of view, it is. So that's another big topic I don't want to get more into. Now, the Upanishads are kind of the final and more philosophical portion of the Veda. And that's all I'll say about it. Amy also asks, who encoded yoga into moon and sun terminology? Well, that's a tantric teaching that passes over into hatha yoga as well. So both tantra and hatha yoga make much of lunar and solar terminology, lunar and solar symbology, and that's a huge topic. One could write an entire book just on lunar and solar symbology in tantra and hatha yoga. But again, this is not something that is pinned to one particular human author at all. And again, the tradition's just not even concerned with that question. By the way, I'm not seeing comments in the live feed, as often happens. Facebook fail. In general, I'm moving away from Facebook Live. It's just not a good technology. Surprising, really, because Facebook has 2 billion users. And I say that just in case, Zuckerberg's eavesdropping. Well, he always is, but whether the data gets scraped and registered, I have no idea. Where are we? Feather says, why do you think long-term relationship is not talked about much here in this community? Well, for the reason that the tantric sources almost never discuss it. Well, they never discuss it. Tantric sources never discuss relationship, long-term or otherwise. And that itself, it might seem surprising, but it's really not very surprising if you're aware of the considerable differences between kind of modern human culture and pre-modern human culture. So psychology is a modern, phenomenon, and kind of the idea of a psychology of relationships is a modern phenomenon. Negotiating boundaries and needs is a modern phenomenon, because what did ancient cultures have? They had very specific gender-based rules that everyone either followed or was supposed to follow, and pre-modern cultures in general, there was just a right and wrong. This is how you're supposed to function as an unmarried man, as a married man, as an unmarried woman, as a married woman. In some cultures, there's a third gender, including pre-modern India. There was a third gender as well, napumsaka, which is just a catch-all term, really, for all those who are not explicitly male or female. But they had given roles and responsibility, kind of given roles in society, as the Kama Sutra discusses, eunuchs, terrible translation, hermaphrodites, terrible translation. There's no good translation for napumsaka, but anyway, one of their roles in pre-modern society was massage, including erotic massage. In the Kama Sutra mentions that. And anyway, the point is that everybody had assigned roles that were gender-based, and so there wasn't negotiation of needs and boundaries, right, which is based in a modern view of individualism, in which everybody's allowed to have different needs and boundaries independent of their gender and independent of their sex as well. Completely modern idea. No precedent for it in pre-modern culture. So why would these pre-modern sources discuss relationships as we understand them? There's no reason to. Now, having said that, there were tantric masters, liberated beings who broke out of these roles and molds, and one of them is the famous female Kashmiri poet saint Lala, also known as Laldev or Laleshwari, and she is one of a number of saints, female as well as male, who radically broke out of these socially prescribed roles. But in the sense, they're the exception that proves the rule, because only someone who's radically liberated, in every possible way, spiritually and culturally, could legitimately ignore the prescribed role. So in a very real sense, especially for a woman, but really for everyone, but especially for a woman in pre-modern India, you only have three choices. Enact your role prescribed for your gender and position in society, or drop out and become a saint, or drop out and become a prostitute. No other choices, really. So it's a totally different world. And again, yes, it was a patriarchal society, but also men were virtually as equally constrained, not not equally. They were a little less constrained, but almost. It's a big topic. So, so yeah, there's no advice for your relationship in tantric sources. Sorry, and there's no advice on how to have better sex either. Right? There are sexual meditations, but they are meditations that seek to entrain sexuality into your liberation process, just like meditations on food seek to entrain eating into your liberation process. Right? So there's no information about how to have better sex or better relationships in any tantric source. So very good to know that, and that's the clearest way to distinguish Tantra from Neo-Tantra. Now, as a follow-up question, Wendy asks, if one really abides in essence nature, will there still be a longing for long-term intimate relationship with a special one? Absolutely, maybe. It's not predictable, because life, I mean, part of the state of being liberated is allowing life to move through you however it does. And if it moves through you in the form of a longing for intimate relationship, then that's part of what it's doing. And then if intimate relationship manifests, that's part of what life is doing. And if it doesn't, that's also part of what life is doing. And people are like, wait a second, why would life give you a longing for intimate relationship that then is not fulfilled by an actual intimate relationship? But that question is a misunderstanding of what we mean when we say life. We don't mean God under another name. We don't mean some supernatural guy up there who's like, here is your longing for intimate relationship. It's just what happens, and it's determined by countless factors on every possible level, right? Life is biological as much as it's spiritual. Why do you have a longing for intimate relationship and someone else doesn't? Well, the answer to every why question is the same. Because of everything. Everything is caused by everything else. So you can't actually say. Now, part of Wendy's question, though, is, notice she said, will there still be a longing for long-term intimate relationship with a special one? So she's kind of implying there, if you're abiding in essence nature, are some people more special than others? Absolutely, on the level of body-mind, and body-mind is real. It doesn't cease to be real just because you're abiding in essence nature, and it doesn't cease to be valuable, right? So, now, if you're abiding in essence nature, you can see the divinity of all beings, but that doesn't mean you like everyone. Everyone's God, and some forms of God you like hanging out with, and some you don't, on the level of body-mind at least. And that, again, is real, and it's prominent in our experience. So, yeah, there might be a special one, but also it's also the case that some people do, as a part of their awakening process, some people do fall in love with everyone. But that not usually in such a way that means they want to, have sex with everyone or marry everyone. I've actually never seen that be the case. But you can definitely have the experience of falling in love with everyone, and you could even have the experience, some do, some don't, that you really love everyone equally. But again, that doesn't mean that you necessarily want to partner with more than one person. It's not impossible that you would want to partner with multiple people, but it's not predictable on the basis of being in love with everyone, right? Because that's kind of something that sort of transcends sexuality per se. Right. Nandikesha in the live feed says, curious to hear any thoughts you have about what a tantric initiation is an initiation into. Well, the original tradition is super clear about that. Initiation is initiation into the daily practice of relationship with a mantra deity. That's kind of, if we're really going to boil it down, that's what the original tradition is understands. This is initiation into access to scriptures and mantras and powerful kind of configurations of energy that non-initiates don't have access to, but primarily initiation into the relationship, the daily relationship with a mantra deity, a deity in the form of mantra. So an introduction to a deity and the deity's expression as that mantra. That's what initiation was originally all about. There's a lot more to it, but that's the kind of sine qua non, the fundamental element. Judy in the live feed says, perhaps too academic, but Abhinavagupta's view seems like what I've studied in theology as panentheism. Please explain how it is different, if indeed it is. Yeah, it's panentheism. It's also idealism. It's a consciousness-only view, but it's panentheism in the sense that Abhinavagupta and his lineage, it's never about one guy, right? Even if we say Patanjali or Abhinavagupta, we're talking about them as a representative of a whole tradition and lineage. So Abhinavagupta's view is panentheistic, if by that you mean the divine is the totality of manifest reality, but something more than that as well. As one of my teachers like to say, the divine is more than meets the eye, and yet it's everything the eye can meet. Right? So that's a simple kind of mnemonic, easy to remember way of thinking of this doctrine. The divine constitutes the whole of reality, the whole of manifestation, the whole of nature, that's pantheism, but something more than that, undefinably more than that as well, panentheism. The divine is transcendent and immanent simultaneously. That's a central teaching in this lineage. Most clearly articulated, actually, not by Abhinavagupta himself, but by Kshemarāja. Well, actually, no, they both do. They both articulate it perfectly clearly. Rowan asks in the live feed, are tantrikas developing new methods of practice based on the classical teachings, and is this considered a continuum in the growth and depth of the tradition? The answer is yes, but nobody admits it. So, an example might be Lair Short. He wrote many books, including Body of Light. He's still alive and teaching in Taos, New Mexico. He's quite on the elderly side. His teacher was Rudy. And, there are other examples. I don't mean to pick him out per se, but they Lair and his teacher are innovators. But it's traditional not to admit that you're an innovator. And I would say that Lair Short is an example of somebody innovating on the basis of tradition, not innovating randomly the way people do in modern postural yoga sometimes. I just came up with this and I'm going to brand it and tell everyone it's my unique thing and see if they'll pay me for it. No, it's, somebody like Lair Short is innovating on the basis of decades of practice, but also deep, deep rootedness in tradition. And this is how traditions change and grow. But traditionally, you don't admit you're innovating because everything is supposed to be have decades, or not decades, centuries of or millennia of hoary antiquity behind it, backing it up. That's just the nature of the tradition, So it's quite the opposite of other spiritual traditions like the New Age movement, which doesn't call itself the New Age movement anymore, but scholars still call it that, in which innovation is highlighted. Oh, this is the new teaching. This is the new revelation, It's the opposite in Tantra. In Tantra, in fact, traditional authors had to defend themselves against the charge of originality. They had to try to show how what they're teaching is based in the scriptures, even if it wasn't. Because originality is a serious accusation. Why? Well, it makes sense, because if somebody just made something up, it's very suspect, you know. But again, there's another option besides making stuff up and reading it straight out of a scripture, which is nuance and kind of moderate forms of innovation on the basis of tradition. Hi, everyone. By the way, I'm now getting comments in the live feed, but a lot less than are being posted, I can tell. There's just a few, and I'm sure you guys are posting more. So I may not be seeing your comment. A couple more questions. Somebody whose pseudonym is Apollo Adama, because he or she is clearly a Battlestar Galactica fan, which, by the way, does include some spiritual teachings, even quasi-tantric ones, and people with very good hearing will note that the opening theme of Battlestar Galactica includes the Gayatri mantra, right? And some other mantra is woven in there as well. Anyway, this person asks, what is the difference, if any, between Buddhist and Hindu Tantra? Huge, huge, huge question, but I just wanted to take a moment, to address it a little bit, because Buddhist and Hindu Tantra are so similar in so many ways, especially in terms of practice, a little bit more than philosophy, so similar in so many ways, and yet significantly different also. And in fact, the most significant difference, as far as I could tell, is in the realm of sexuality. Meaning to say, in Hindu Tantra, or Shaiva Tantra, meaning the Shiva Shakti tradition, sexuality is largely absent as a theme in the Tantras. It's here and there. Abhinavagupta teaches a detailed sexual meditation called the Kula Yaga. But that's really the only, we just have one source in the whole, in the vast, vast body of literature for, a sexual meditation that's liberative. And in Buddhist Tantra, sexuality is much, much more present. And one of the easiest ways to see this, it was more present. And then when Buddhism was monasticized, it was sanitized, right? So sexuality is usually present as a strong metaphorical theme in Buddhist Tantra, and also as a literal practice, but not as much as it used to be. Because if you look back 1,000 years ago to Buddhist Tantric initiation rites, unlike Shaiva Tantric initiation rites, they always included a sexual element. Okay, so this is in fact even sort of shocking for those who are used to Shaiva Tantra, which again, initiation would almost never include a transgressive or sexual element in Shaiva Tantra. And by almost never, I'm talking about lineages. There's a few kind of subset lineages over in the far left that did, but by and large, Shaiva Tantra initiation rites had no sexual element. Whereas in Buddhist Tantric initiation, circa 900 years ago, I don't know if I should get into explicit detail like this, but part of the initiation was to receive a drop of bodhicitta on your tongue. And by bodhicitta, we mean a drop of semen from the guru, a drop of the guru's semen, the initiating guru's semen, on your tongue, which you had to receive, right? Otherwise, you disqualified from the whole initiation. You had to receive that drop of semen on your tongue as the essence of bodhicitta itself, the aspiration for enlightenment in tangible form, right? So that doesn't happen in Shaiva initiation then or now. So clearly we can say the sexual element is more central. And indeed, back then, not more recently, but back then, if you were a Buddhist initiate into Tantra who was going to practice with a consort, then the guru would consecrate your consort by having sex with them, and then present them to you, right? Don't get me started about that. There's issues. There's definitely issues. But yeah, that's a feature of the majority forms of Buddhist Tantric initiation way back then. Now, of course, there's going to be people who dispute that. No, it was always metaphorical. No. Harunaga Isaacson has written about this. He's an article called Eating the Moon, and the moon is another metaphor for semen. Okay, so yeah. Anyway, that was just a way of kind of illustrating graphically how Buddhist and Shaiva Tantra were and are very different. But, even though some of those differences were elided, dropped away over time, still it's the case that if you look in modern teachers like Lama Yeshe's book on Introduction to Tantra, he says sexual sadhana is an indispensable part of tantric sadhana. And there are modern Buddhist tantric teachers who will say that, right? But we can't say that vis-a-vis Shaiva tantric sadhana. It was an option for some lineages, but it was never considered an indispensable part of the sadhana, which is a huge difference. Do you see what I mean? Like, you can't be liberated or enlightened in any final sense without this sexual practice, say some Buddhist tantrics. And no Shaiva tantrics say that, even though Abhinavagupta said, oh, this sexual meditation is really powerful, it's really awesome, it could liberate you, but it's not required. Nobody says it's required, right? Pretty huge distinction then. And anyway, this is pertinent to a little argument that Apollo Adama and I were having on the Facebook group, where he was saying I was wrong to characterize Tantra as not particularly interested in sex, and I clarified I'm talking about Shaiva Tantra. And he was dubious. But just look at the scholarship on both sides. Cool. Nora says, no, there's not too many comments in the live feed. There's just a few. We're listening carefully for once. Sometimes people do type a lot, which is kind of multitasking. Judy says, do we have a date for Tantrika Institute's curriculum to start? Yes, we are hoping and working hard for September 15th. For the beginning of the Tantrika Institute online learning portal and curriculum. When are we moving off Facebook? Not till the end of the year, because the online learning portal of Tantrika Institute will not have a Facebook-like component, a robust chat forum right away. That'll come later. But we will migrate the community off Facebook as diligently as we possibly can at the end of the year. Divyam asks, how to read tantric texts in a way that we get the gūdha, or secret meaning, from the text with the teacher. That's the only way. We have in the Facebook group a wonderful member of the community named Florentine, who's so good at answering people's questions, and often I'm not available or can't answer everyone's question. Talking in terms of practical questions, or where do I find what, or where was this question answered. Thank you, Florentine. You've really just done so much great service to the community, and we really appreciate it because people are getting their questions answered a lot more because of you. Hope you're not embarrassed, but I do want to acknowledge that. Hana Kaushalya says, how is COVID in Portugal where you are? No sign of it. Come. Now you run a risk traveling, but just be super careful. Just be careful. Just don't touch anything, and just don't touch anything with your hands, and then touch yourself, your face or whatever. That's definitely, take all the precautions. Hand sanitize a lot. Sanitize things around you. Put on a mask. Get here, and then you're good. Really, there's very little COVID in Portugal, and seemingly none in our immediate area. How can you know? Because people can be asymptomatic, blah, blah, blah. But are you going to let fear rule your life, or are you going to come to paradise? Okay, that's a manipulative way to frame the question, but there's some truth to it. Let's be honest. Okay. Americans, I'm afraid Americans are in a different position because of the, incompetence of the government in addressing the pandemic, which now we have realized and seen is really tragic, but no developed country in the world has handled the pandemic as poorly as the U.S., and you're paying the price in the sense that Europe won't let you travel here, at least for tourist reasons. You can come for work. If you have work and you can show you have work in Europe, the work that brings you to Europe, you are able to fly here, just not for tourist reasons. So yeah, at this point it's not even political. It doesn't matter what political party you are. Just vote out the current administration and vote in one that will handle the pandemic in such a way that you are not the laughingstock of the world, and you're free to travel to other countries. That would be a great thing. And I hope you agree that that's not a political statement anymore. Lena says, about the 5 powers of God, isn't the power of bliss love? Yeah. That's a topic for a much longer video, but I'll say yes to that. Okay, let's wrap this up soon. Two more questions. Margit. No, I can't remember if I'm saying that right. She even told me how to say it, but I've forgotten again. Margit, I think. My question is, what does non-dual Shaiva Tantra have to say, if anything, about reincarnation and having to start over again? And she mentions she was brought up in conservative, dogmatic Christianity, and she says, in my next incarnation, will I be born into another crazy cult-like religion, meaning Christianity, and I can relate to that characterization, and have to start all over. So, she says, does history repeat itself? Will I be born into a similar situation and have to start all over? The answer is no. But that can't be taken necessarily to imply an answer to the following question, which is, does what we learn in each incarnation go with us into the next one? Broadly speaking, the tradition says yes. Not in the sense that you kind of remember lessons and carry them over, but in the sense that there's somehow, through some unknown mechanism, there is some kind of progression, in the sense that when you've lived enough human lifetimes that you realize the value of a precious human birth and don't waste it on doing only what all the other animals do, then you're ready and ripe for the spiritual path, right? So there is some sense in the tradition in which there's some form of progression. It doesn't have to do with remembering lessons, because you don't really remember anything, but it has to do with some kind of maturation or maturity or ripening. The tradition actually uses this phrase or this word, ripening, such that, after some number of lifetimes and some number of life experiences, you become ripe enough to find the spiritual path. And then you find it each and every lifetime until your realization of essence nature occurs. Now, that's not to say that it's actually progressive, like you become 29% enlightened in this life, and next life it'll be 32%. They don't imply that ever, but they do imply they explicitly state, once you find the spiritual path, you keep finding it, and then one of those lives you complete it, meaning you say you realize who and what you are, and you abide in that realization. For a wonderful poetic articulation of this, see Adyashanti's poem, Awakening. If you Google Adyashanti poem Awakening, it comes up. It maybe doesn't even have a title. I'm learning not to say Google, right? Because it's actually, we don't want Google to rule the world or even the internet, so we shouldn't call all internet searches by that verb. Thank you, Glenn. So if you do an internet search, perhaps with a non-evil search engine like DuckDuckGo, you will also find Adyashanti's poem, Awakening, or it's about awakening. I don't know if it has a title. And by the way, Google's motto, at least for the first 20 years of their existence, was "Don't be evil," and they failed. Just in case you didn't know. It's amazing. That was their motto up on the wall, and they just failed. But, whatever. It's all part of life. Okay. Mari says, I would love to hear from you some words about death. It's the longer version of the question, but I'll just read this bit. I would love to hear from you some words about death, our own death, death of our beloved ones, and sort of how to become accepting of that. Another big topic, but I wanted to just touch on this important topic. Now, for a tantrika, it's inherently part of the tantric path, actually, that we contemplate death as much as possible without getting depressed. And that varies by individual to individual, right? So how much death contemplation can you do without getting upset, depressed, morbid, or anything like that? That's for you to find out. But the tradition certainly recommends do as much death contemplation as you can, ideally once a day, if you can, without getting all depressed about it, right? Now, if you realize the truth about death, then it's not depressing at all. As Walt Whitman said, has anyone supposed it lucky to be born? Well, it is just as lucky to die, and I know it. Speaking from an awakened perspective. And this point was so important that he reiterated it at another point in the poem and said, to die is different from what anyone has supposed, and luckier. So the first one, though, is really worthy of your contemplation. Has anyone supposed it lucky to be born? Well, it is just as lucky to die. What could that mean? Well, contemplate it. the Tantrikas, like many other spiritual paths as well, say death gives meaning to life. Death is the great teacher, the greatest teacher. Right? We see this in many traditions, right? In indigenous shamanic traditions of Mexico, for example, this teacher who went by the pseudonym Don Juan said, if you ever want to get a clear answer to a question in life, ask your death. He's always there, just at arm's length, over your shoulder. And when you ask him, he reminds you to drop all your pettiness. He reminds you of what's really at stake. Right? It's a powerful teaching. How do we live our lives when we live in remembrance of death? Do we not indeed drop all our pettiness in our interactions with others and in our behavior and conduct? Do we not place more value on moments of profound love and connection? Do we not place less value on all those elements of your life that might be written up in your obituary? You know? I mean, that's changing nowadays. People's obituaries often say, oh, this was a loving person, a kind person, right? But in the old days, it was just, he accomplished this and that, you know? He got a lot of things done, but that's not what anyone cares about in the face of death. So, yeah. Traditionally, Tantrika remembers every day. This body-mind will die. Everything it does will be forgotten. So not only will I die, but everything I do will be forgotten. Now, in light of that truth, what's at stake? What do you care about? What's worth doing? Tantrika remembers every day. This body will die. And not only that, traditionally, you go to the cremation grounds. Traditionally, you go to the cremation grounds every day for months until you get it. You keep watching bodies burn, and you say, this one's going to be there pretty soon. We don't have that possibility in Western culture. It's tragic, actually, that you can't go to the cremation grounds and watch bodies burn. It's the best, fastest way to accelerate your awakening process. You know, if you're not the sort of person, you know, who just gets really depressed about it. So Mukta says, what is bliss then? Well, that's exactly it. Bliss is possible because of death. Everything becomes infinitely precious when you acknowledge and realize it's impermanent. Everything just gets a brief moment in the sun, and that's why it's precious. Look at how we humans take everything for granted, even when it's all impermanent, and even when everyone is going to die. And we still take it for granted. You know, a lot of things, most people just taking stuff for granted, right? So imagine how much worse would we be at taking things, meaning how much more would we take things for granted if they weren't impermanent? Nothing would have preciousness. You might not believe it, but investigate, you'll see it's true. So that's a good note to end on. If you understand the nature of death, you will see that is a cheerful note to end on. And if those teaching Tantra workshops, right, were to ask me, what's the one thing we could do to make our teaching more closer to original Tantra? Well, talk about death. Less about pleasure, more about death. That's a quick way to make your workshop more authentically tantric. But also nice if you study the original tradition, etc. Om. P.S. Postscript. Right? It's both and, right? There are those who love this just sweetness and light. Can we just talk about sweetness and light and how beautiful everything is, and rainbows everywhere, and everything is God, and it's all beautiful, and then there are those who, focus on, well, let's acknowledge suffering. Let's acknowledge the reality of death. Let's be real. It's both and in this tradition. Sweetness and light in the face of death, seeing death as beautiful as well as everything else. Okay. So lastly, last postscript, the center here in Portugal is open. We have a couple guests here right now. I'm looking at them, and they're beautiful. And they have... Come. Oh, hey, Bindu. Hey, this is Bindu. Now, Glenn, having a Tibetan Buddhist background, calls him Tigle, which is Bindu in Tibetan. Yeah, so come and be here, please. We want you. There's not many people. It's not crowded. And you won't, in fact, the risk is on our side. You coming to visit the center, the risk, we're taking the risk, not you. Just so you know. Bye-bye. Love you.